Every curse leaves behind ruins, and in this story, the ruins were not made of stone or wood, they were human. The descendants who lived decades later found themselves haunted by emotions they couldn't name, weighed down by fears they never understood. Some avoided marriage altogether, as if instinctively recoiling from the same trap that had consumed their ancestors. Others stumbled into relationships marked by control, secrecy, or violence, repeating the cycle without even realizing it. Trauma has a way of echoing, like a voice shouting through the halls of time, and this family's halls were endless. The final tragedy was not just that a man married his stepsister. It was that the silence around that marriage destroyed more lives than the marriage itself ever could. The silence taught children to mistrust love. The silence turned neighbors into cowards. The silence gave the church permission to look away. And when silence is fed for long enough, it becomes something worse than secrecy. It becomes tradition. When the truth was finally spoken aloud, when the descendants pieced together the marriage certificate, the faded photographs, the whispered recollections of the old, it was as if the house itself exhaled after holding its breath for a century. But revelation does not heal wounds, it only uncovers them. And what lay uncovered in this family's history was not romance, not resilience, but decay, a decay that had burrowed deep into the soil of their lineage, poisoning every branch of the tree. Perhaps the cruelest part is this: they believed they were protecting their family name, that by forcing silence, by legitimizing the union, by pretending it was normal, they were saving themselves from shame. But shame cannot be buried, it only waits, and when it returns, it does so with teeth. This family learned that too late. So now the story exists as a warning, whispered, in the margins of American history. A reminder that love can be twisted, that silence can be more violent than words, and that the darkest truths are not the ones hidden in the earth, but the ones hidden in plain sight, inside the walls of our own homes. He married his stepsister, and the world looked away, and in that silence, generations were lost. Would you have looked away too? Or would you have spoken, knowing it would destroy everything? That is the question that still lingers, long after the house has rotted, long after the names have faded, long after the curse has done its work. The past never dies. It only waits for someone to uncover it. The deeper one digs into the story, the clearer it becomes that this was never about love at all. It was about control, control of image, control of reputation, control of bloodlines. In America's forgotten towns, where family honor mattered more than individual suffering, the line between what was moral and what was useful blurred until it disappeared altogether. A marriage between step-siblings was not viewed as a violation, but as a solution, an arrangement to keep wealth, land, or even appearances intact. What the law ignored, the family enforced, and what the family enforced, the children were made to endure. But every arrangement comes with a price. The children born of this union carried it in their bones, not just in their features, which sometimes bore the subtle signs of twisted genetics, but in their identities. Who were they really? Children of love, or children of silence? Their family tree was more a knot than a line, branches folding back into themselves, names repeating, relationships impossible to explain. Ask them who their uncle was, and you might be told he was also their brother-in-law. Ask them who their aunt was, and you might hear she was also their mother's stepsister. Each answer was a reminder that the family had long stopped caring about truth. They cared only about keeping the story neat enough for outsiders not to question. But outsiders eventually did question. A teacher noticing a child's withdrawn nature, a doctor quietly observing the unusual medical patterns in the family, a neighbor who saw too much through a thin curtain at dusk, and though whispers began to spread, they never grew into accusations. Because in small towns, whispers can destroy you. People kept their voices low, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. To speak the truth would mean tearing apart not just a family, but the illusion of morality the entire community was built upon. And so the silence lingered, feeding itself generation after generation, until the story became more than a private wound. It became a curse whispered about in graveyards, attached to a family name that still makes some lower their voices, a curse that did not need to be written down to survive, because it lived inside the blood itself. When the silence finally cracked, it did not shatter in rage. It bled out slowly, like a wound reopened after years of being hidden under bandages. A grandson found a brittle certificate folded at the bottom of a drawer. A granddaughter discovered letters that spoke in veiled language of shame and duty, and with each discovery the family story unraveled. What had been told as a love story was revealed for what it truly was, a pact of control, disguised as marriage, sanctified by silence. The descendants could not agree on what to do with the truth. Some wanted to bury it again to keep the facade intact. They said, "The past is the past, let the dead rest." But others refused. They could not rest knowing their very existence had been shaped by something so grotesque. They needed to drag it out into the open, no matter how ugly it was. And so the family divided once more, not just by blood, but by belief. Those who chose to face the truth described it as carrying a ghost. It haunted them in unexpected ways. In their marriages, they felt the weight of mistrust. In their children's faces, they sometimes saw not innocence, but echoes of the silence they had inherited. Even in the simple act of introducing themselves, the family name carried a heaviness they could never put into words. That is what makes generational secrets so dangerous. They do not die when the people do. They live on in memory, in behavior, in blood. And here lies the cruelest question of all. Was it really love, or was it survival? For the stepsister, the marriage may have been the only way to maintain safety in a household where her voice carried no weight. For the stepbrother, perhaps it was a way to cling to something he mistook for devotion. But survival disguised as love is a prison with no door, and their children were born into it, carrying a legacy not of freedom, but of chains. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you bury the truth again, or would you drag it out into the light, no matter the cost? Because the cost of silence is always heavier than the cost of truth, and for this family the silence had already devoured too much. In towns like these, reputation was everything. A family could be rotting inside, but as long as they showed up to church on Sundays and waved politely at their neighbors, no one dared to pull back the curtain. That was the cruel genius of it, darkness disguised as decency. The father who gave his blessing for the marriage was seen as a godly man. The mother who kept her silence was praised for her obedience, and the children who smiled in family portraits were admired for their discipline. No one asked questions because no one wanted to be the one to hear the answers. But the silence came at a cost. The children of that marriage bore the marks of it, not always physical but emotional, psychological. Some withdrew into themselves, carrying a lifelong mistrust of intimacy. Others rebelled, desperate to escape the invisible chains their parents had fastened to them, and some carried those scars into their own relationships, never understanding why love always felt like something dangerous. That's the hidden legacy of families like this. Not just the act itself, but the damage it quietly inflicts on every soul connected to it. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the way dinner conversations would drop to whispers, the way footsteps in the hall would pause outside a closed door, the way the children were taught to smile but never to ask. That is how silence passes itself down, through small gestures, through lessons never spoken but always understood. And soon, the line between choice and inheritance disappears. By the time outsiders noticed, it was too late. A new generation had already been born into the shadow. They, too, were expected to carry on as if nothing was wrong, to smile in photographs, to dress in their Sunday best, to play their role in a theater of lies that had been rehearsed for decades. And when some of them grew old enough to ask questions, they were told the same words that had silenced their parents. Don't speak of this. It's family business. The result was a bloodline bound together not by love, but by secrecy, a lineage poisoned by one marriage that was never meant to happen. And like poison, it spread slowly, quietly, but relentlessly. Until one day, a descendant stumbled upon the truth, and the silence that had held for generations began to crack. The house itself became a witness. Every creak in the floorboards, every draft through the window, carried the memory of what had been done inside. Old photographs lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in time. But if you stared too long, the smiles began to distort. You could see it in their eyes. The weight of secrets pressed down on them, heavy as stone. The children, the guests, even the neighbors who came by for supper, they all felt it, though none dared to speak. It was as if the house demanded silence, punishing anyone who threatened to break it. Behind closed doors, the marriage was far from a fairy tale. Resentment grew like mold in damp corners. The step-siblings who had once been forced into a union became strangers within the same bed. She carried the look of someone who wanted to escape, yet every path out was blocked by judgment, shame, and fear. He, shaped by the same silence, convinced himself it was love. Perhaps that was the cruelest twist of all, that they were both trapped in a story they didn't choose, but only one of them believed it was destiny. Generations later, when the story resurfaced, the descendants were left to grapple with a truth they never asked to inherit. They found old documents, marriage certificates, handwritten letters tucked inside Bibles, and as the pieces came together, so did the horror. This wasn't just a single marriage, this was a pattern, a deliberate weaving of control across generations. The parents had known, the grandparents had known, and still they allowed it to happen. For many, the shock was not that the marriage occurred, it was that it was accepted, not a scandal, not a sin, but a quiet arrangement nodded along by family and community alike. The silence was communal, the responsibility shared. Everyone looked away, and by looking away they allowed darkness to root itself deeper. What does that do to a child, growing up in a home where love and loyalty are corrupted? They begin to question what family even means. They grow into adults who do not trust the very concept of love, who see betrayal in every act of kindness, and sometimes they repeat the cycle, not because they want to, but because silence has taught them nothing else is possible. This is the legacy of that marriage, a legacy not written in books, but carved into the faces, the choices, the haunted eyes of those who came after. A story that stretches from one generation's shame to another's confusion, leaving behind a bloodline that feels more like a curse than a family. The beginning always looks innocent. A remarriage, two families stitched together under one roof, the promise of new beginnings. But what begins as family often mutates in silence. The man who became her stepbrother was not a stranger. He was a constant presence, sitting at the same table, sharing the same hallway, the same air. Childhood boundaries blurred into something unspoken, something left unchecked by the adults who should have been guardians. What starts as a stolen glance becomes a hidden touch. And by the time the whispers inside the house grew too loud to ignore, it was already too late. The father approved. The mother turned her head. The church, always ready to condemn the sins of others, suddenly found its tongue tied when it came to sins committed behind its own doors. And so the forbidden was sanctified, wrapped in vows and wedding rings, presented as holy. But the ceremony was no blessing, it was a burial. The burial of innocence, the burial of truth, the burial of two young souls bound together by the will of others. What was meant to be the foundation of their adult lives became the chains that held them captive. Imagine the weight of it, to live day after day with a spouse who was also a sibling, to share a bed with someone who once shared your home as family, and to know that every whispered prayer, every neighbor's nod of approval was built on a secret you could never speak. For them, intimacy was not born of choice. It was an inheritance of silence, and silence is the most dangerous inheritance of all. Because silence spreads. It creeps into the walls, into the children who were born from this union, into the stories never told but always felt. The children grew up knowing something was wrong, even if they couldn't name it. They saw the nervous glances exchanged across the table, the strained conversations, the way their parents avoided questions with practiced ease. They inherited not just a family name, but a fracture in their own identity. And so the marriage of a man and his stepsister did not just shape their lives, it shaped generations. What was hidden in one house became a pattern, a shadow stretching forward in time. Every child, every grandchild, born into this bloodline carried the echo of that silence. And silence, when left unbroken, does not die, it multiplies. He married his stepsister. At first, that sentence sounds like nothing more than a scandal whispered behind church doors, the kind of gossip that would wither under the weight of time. But this story isn't gossip. It's a wound, carefully hidden, covered with smiles in family portraits and Bible verses read at dinner tables. It is the kind of wound that festers in silence, where shame and secrecy become the air a household breathes. Imagine growing up in a home where boundaries blur, where trust is not nurtured but violated, where the words family and love are twisted into something unrecognizable. Now imagine discovering years later that what you thought was peculiar, what you thought was your family's burden alone, was not just a single choice, not just a marriage, but part of something far more sinister, a cycle of control, of silence, of inherited corruption. They said it was legal. They said it was normal. After all, she wasn't his blood. The law turned its face away, the church muttered but did not act, and the neighbors, well, they only whispered when the lights were off. But in the silence of that house, when the front door was locked and the curtains pulled tight, the truth could not be ignored. A boy became a man too fast, a girl was forced into womanhood too soon, and the ceremony that should have been a celebration was nothing but a mask. The mask of respectability, the mask of tradition. Behind it was a grotesque fusion of fatherhood, motherhood, step relations, and marriage. A family tree tangled beyond recognition, its branches curling back upon themselves. You may think this is an isolated tale, a tragic accident of love and circumstance, but buried in American soil are countless stories just like this. Families in rural towns, locked in their own cycles, hidden by distance and by shame, marriages that were less about love and more about control. And when the children born of these unions looked in the mirror, they didn't see themselves. They saw the weight of decisions made long before they could speak, decisions that twisted their futures into shapes they never chose. Every photograph tells a lie. The smiles at weddings, the Sunday best clothing, the promise of a happy home, all carefully staged to conceal what really lived inside those walls. And the deeper you look, the more the lie begins to rot, revealing the bones beneath. This is not just a story of a man who married his stepsister. It is the story of a family poisoned from within. And the truth that comes next is darker than most can bear.